Wherever war and upheaval is going on, even in some of the most difficult of circumstances, there is sometimes a place for basic common decency. And that place is where organisations such as the International Red Cross and Red Crescent work. Their role is stipulated by the so-called Geneva Conventions, their origin dating back to 1864. It's a set of rules that details what's allowed and not allowed during warfare, and the convention has expressly given the organisation an important role to play to assist people in war to preserve their dignity and their lives. But this role has come at a price, because it needs to work with states and actors. No matter how brutal they are, they're very careful about criticising those who are fighting. Today on Talk to Al Jazeera, we sit down with the President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Peter Maurer, to discuss their mission and how to stay neutral in the face of armed conflict. Peter Maurer, President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera. You have in the past described ICRC as a very special humanitarian player. Explain to me what makes you different from other humanitarian organisations, in particular your role as the guardian of the Geneva Conventions.
I think what is particular and special about the ICRC that it combines an operational activity on the ground at the front lines and close to violence and to perpetrators, but also to the civilian suffering from this conflict, that it combines this operational experience on the ground with a mandate from the international community to look after the Geneva Conventions, to help them implement those Geneva Conventions, which regulates the behavior of parties to conflict in warfare and their obligations not to target the civilians and to allow independent organizations to reach those civilians. So it's the combination of operational experience on the ground, legal mandate from the international community, and also this policy and diplomacy and advocacy mandate for victims of violence and war, which has accompanied us now for 150 years. If you look at many other organizations who do a lot of good work, they are often limited to one of the aspects. They have an operational mandate, they deliver services, they focus on a specific issues, on health, on children, on something very specific, while ICRC has this very comprehensive mandate attached to the Geneva Conventions in law, policy and operations.
Everyone has heard of the Geneva Conventions. They are the rules of war and what shouldn't be done in war. But perhaps you could explain a little bit more about what the Geneva Conventions are and what they say.
Well, I think the Geneva Convention basically, if I look at today's reality, they highlight three important issues which are of critical importance. They oblige belligerents to respect rules with the use of their weapons. And those rules say that you need to engage into, that you need to make a distinction between civilians and militaries, and that you should use your weapons only and your military operations to have a military advantage against another military and not against civilians. So it sets rules for what we call the conduct of hostilities in war. It sets rules with regard to the humane treatment of those who are not participating in war, those who are detained, those who are out of combat, those who are civilians and never participated in the war. And they offer rules for the facilitation of humanitarian assistance and protection to those people for independent humanitarian organizations. So in the most delicate circumstances where war is raging, they establish a minimum of humanity and rules which establish a minimum of humanity. And what is interesting about the convention is that these conventions have not been negotiated out of the blue. In the 19th century in Europe, they capture the experience of centuries of warfare and rules in all the different cultures of the world. If we look, talking to Al Jazeera, how much the Geneva Conventions are in sync with Islamic law as it is set, and with regard to the behavior, what Islamic law says in warfare, it's identical. It's the same rules. If you look at other cultural horizons, it's again the same. So the Geneva Convention capture hundreds of years of experience of warfare to maintain the basis of humanity in warfare.
So historic and noble documents. Let's take it back to Syria. Barrel bombs, suicide bombs, chemical weapons, executions, political prisoners, tortures, sieges. No one is obeying these rules 150 years on, are they?
Well, you are right that it is a great concern for a president of the ICRC as a guardian of the Geneva Convention that these conventions are repeatedly and systematically violated in conflict. We don't know any of the conflicts in 150 years of history where there haven't been violations of those rules.
But aren't there more violations now?
We have certainly to look into the pattern of violations that we encounter today, and this pattern is a serious pattern of violations that we see. Whether there is more or less, I have always to remind people when I am asked these questions that we have been active in world wars, we have been active at the front line when genocide happened in Rwanda, in the Balkans. And of course, these were outrageous violations of international humanitarian law. So I'm always cautious to say we are in a worse situation than ever. But it's right, your question alludes to a right problem. These rules are violated at the present moment in a very serious way in many of the conflicts, not only in Syria, but also, let's be very frank, they are an important guidance, and we never talk about those instances where they are respected.
Where are they respected in Syria?
And
where have they been respected in Syria?
it is interesting when you look at conflicts that in our engagement with parties to the conflicts, the Geneva Conventions are an important framework to allow us to negotiate access to populations, to engage in a conversation on the conduct of hostilities that I mentioned beforehand, to negotiate access to detention facilities. It's not falling from the sky as just an obvious thing which falls into our lap, but it's a framework which is an important guidance on how we can engage with states in order to respect those laws, and not only states but also non-state actors.
Let's talk about some of the specific areas covered by the Geneva Conventions. Let's look at medical care, health care. The first Geneva Convention requires that the wounded and sick be protected and respected. Now, certainly in Syria, that is not taking place, is it? I'm looking at some figures from Physicians for Human Rights. 382 attacks on 269 separate facilities between March 2011 and the end of June 2016. And interestingly, they say that of those 382, 344 were committed by one side, the Syrian government. As the guardian of the conventions, do you need to call out those that are responsible for these abuses?
Well, we certainly take those abuses and those violations as an obligation for engagement with the respective parties, and that's what we do in all the conflicts of the world. We use the convention as a platform for dialogue to change behavior.
Dialogue behind the scenes. You don't often speak out, do you? I don't think. Tell me, will you condemn the Syrian government for those 344 attacks on on hospitals and other medical facilities? And will you say the Syrian government is more responsible than anyone else for those? Because you're normally very cautious. Why?
We are very cautious because at the end of the day, in the balance between having a possibility to dialogue, to access and to change behavior, even in a small step, we consider this on balance more important than speaking out. And that's the whole principle of confidentiality. We are in detention facilities, we visit detention facilities all over the world. If we would start to speak out what we see in those detention facilities, we wouldn't be there. So very often confidentiality is not something we want to hide, but it's a protected space which is necessary to engage states in order so that they can change behavior and that we can slowly nudge them into better respect of international humanitarian law. We haven't visited prisoners at the beginning of the war in Syria. We visit certain detention facilities now. We hope to do more. And so is the case in many other conflicts of the world. We engage with the militaries in the conflict to review their military operation when they have attacked hospitals, and we want them to change this behavior. And confidentiality very often on the specificity of what we see and how the dialogue works is an important tool. It's not an end in itself, it's a tool to have access, to keep a dialogue rolling and to change behavior over time.
I'm sure, though, you are prepared to condemn the way that healthcare facilities have been targeted in Syria.
We certainly condemn that healthcare facilities are targeted, not only in Syria, in many other conflicts of the world, but we are very cautious unless we have clear indication that the one side or the other did it. We are always very cautious just to use international humanitarian law and its violations as an extended tool of accusations and warfare, but rather understand it as a necessity to create a space in which better behavior can eventually be result through dialogue. That's our function. I don't criticize those organizations who choose other ways and other tactics, but it's also our established sort of methodology that longer than others we keep things confidential and we try to create that space in which we can have access, and we make recommendations to the signatories of the Geneva Conventions for change to the better, and we follow up on those recommendations, and eventually we contribute to changing behavior. We have seen that nobody wanted us to talk to the Taliban 15 years ago in Afghanistan. We started to engage with the Taliban on international humanitarian law. And while this is not paradise today, we see improvements for the better. There is concern for civilians in some of the operations. Our concerns are still there, but it's a different methodology than the one other advocacy organizations choose.
So do we risk a lost generation?
Well, I think we certainly have a risk of a generation of kids being out of school for much too long time. I see also some hope on the horizon through the new forms of connectivity. When I visit Syria, when I visit Iraq and Yemen, I'm surprised to see how much these kids are self-educating, how smart they are in getting a smartphone, in getting connected to the world, in understanding what is going on. But I think there is a possibility that those kids will be able to resume and to catch up one day. But this doesn't excuse, of course, the terrible situation in which we are, where hospitals are targeted and impacted by warfare, where schools are targeted and impacted, where hospitals and schools are misused by the belligerents and made from particularly protected sites into misused sites of battlegrounds.
You've already mentioned the issue of prisoners, which is one of the bits of your work that normally you try and keep a little bit below the radar, but I try and get some details from you. How many prisoners do you currently believe are being held in Syria by the various parties?
We don't speculate on figures, and we know those prisoners which we have visited. We are, as you say,
which sides are allowing you to visit?
The Syrian government allows us to
into
visit
all their prisons?
Into their official prisons, but we cannot visit some of the pre-prison detention facilities. So we have certain possibilities, we have certain indications, but indeed, as you say, one of the recipes of having access to detention facilities normally that we are very discreet about what we see, what the situation is, because our recommendations are targeted to the prison authorities, to the responsible authorities in the country. And that's how we try to improve the situation in detention facilities. We, as ICRC, visit roughly 1 million prisoners all over the world in more than 100 countries a year. So it's an important body of experience which comes together, but it's up to others to talk about those issues.
Because I've spoken to former prisoners of the Syrian government and they talk about appalling conditions. Would you say there are appalling conditions?
Well, we don't mention and we don't make any public judgments on the conditions we find in prisons, neither in Syria nor in Guantanamo or in any other place we visit.
You've talked about Afghanistan and mentioned contacts with the Taliban. Again, something you were very reluctant when I tried to do stories about it about a decade ago to talk about. You're now happy to talk about it. Are you prepared to deal with any group in any conflict? Because clearly I'm referring to ISIL. Are they beyond the pale, or are you prepared to deal with a group that carries out executions, cutting heads off with a knife on camera, setting a prisoner, a Jordanian pilot, ablaze in a cage, carrying out executions by carried out by children? Would you talk to ISIL? Do you talk to ISIL?
The whole essence of the role of ICRC as a guardian of the Geneva Convention is really to talk to all parties to conflicts. That's the terminology of the Geneva Conventions, and to engage with parties to the conflict so that they respect international humanitarian law. The fact that this law is violated by parties to the conflict is not a reason for us not to talk. Because, again, as the Convention says it, without prejudice to any recognition or status that we are conferring. So the international community has created this small space which gives an opportunity to ICRC to talk to all sides, not to confer any legitimacy on belligerents, but to do the utmost to ensure a minimum of humanity in conflict. And this needs engagement with all those who carry weapons and who are engaged in conflict. Now, this does not mean that those who carry weapons and are engaged in conflict, including Islamic State group, are ready to talk to us. But from ICRC, there is no principled opposition in a conflict situation to talk to all parties to the conflict which are in control of territory and people who suffer from the impact of warfare. Because at the end of the day, our objective is to relieve the suffering of people who suffer from the impact of warfare. So we have to reach them, so we have to talk to them, to those who are in control of those people.
So have you talked to ISIL, or have you managed to communicate perhaps through intermediaries?
Well, as you know, ISIL is not a group which you can easily know who is part of and has a telephone number to call. So we certainly reach out, and we try to reach out wherever we are in those conflicts, and you know in which conflicts we are in the world, to all those who carry weapons, in order to find possibilities to access people in need.
Doing this work is extremely dangerous. Do you worry about your staff who are doing this work? In some ways, I see you, perhaps as an odd comparison, a bit like a general. A general deploys his staff into battle, or his soldiers into battle. You deploy your staff into the battlefield, even though they're not fighting. They're in harm's way.
Well, it's one of the concerns, of course, the primary concern, I would say, for a president of an institution which has now 15,000 collaborators all over the world and in most of the most dangerous places, to define each and every day with its staff on what the duty of care is for its own staff, because each and every day we are confronted with a dilemma. Do we dare to an operation and therefore risk the life and safety of our staff, or do we abort and not try to go into a certain context in which warfare is going on? I think in 150 years we have learned, and we have a lot of skilled staff, and we educate staff, and we try to get more professional in analyzing the situation on the ground, and we have our security protocol which allow us to go a far way, and in many ways farther than many others, into dangerous zones and still be able to operate. But of course, each and every day is a concern, and even more so the nights, when I think about what my colleagues are doing in the field. What I can say is that despite everything that we have said about today's conflicts, we have still managed to do an incredible amount of humanitarian work in some of those most dangerous parts with relatively little harm for our people. But at the same time, we are concerned that increasingly our local colleagues, the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, the Yemeni Arab Red Crescent, the Afghani Red Crescent, are targeted and become victims also of this warfare.
Is part of your protection the neutrality you keep talking about?
Well, I think it's absolutely essential that neutral, impartial and independent humanitarian work, as we like to define it, is critical. Engagement with all parties is critical. We don't carry weapons for our protection. We don't want soldiers around our operations. We function through transparency and notification and engagement with all parties in order to have their consent for our operations. And this is what gives us security, and their perception of our work as being mutual and impartial is absolutely essential. It's not only us defining what we would like to be, it's also to be seen by the belligerents as a credible, neutral and impartial actor. If we lose this, we are in big trouble.
Peter Maurer, President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you very much for your interest.